In your custody, he asked, whose health might be endangered by serving further time? The superintendent's reply was unambiguous. All of the suffragists.
They were incredibly weak and beaten up. They hadn't eaten in days, and nobody wanted to have a dead suffragist on their hands.
Alice Paul and the others on hunger strike were the first to be released. They passed through the gates of the district jail just hours later, some too frail to walk without aid, and were met by a clutch of reporters seeking comment from Miss Paul.
We were put out of jail as we were put in, at the whim of the government. They tried to terrorize and suppress us. They could not, so they freed us. We hope that no more demonstrations will be necessary. But what we do depends entirely on what the administration does.
The news broke 6 weeks later in headlines from coast to coast. With the House of Representatives finally set to vote on the federal suffrage amendment, Wilson had met privately with a dozen key Democrats and had urged the amendment's passage, calling it an act of right and justice.
Early on, if you were going to put money down on whether or not Wilson would become a fierce advocate, going to personally plead with Congress on behalf of the federal women's suffrage amendment, that would not have been a good bet. But things changed pretty significantly by the middle of his second term.
Just days before, in what would come to be called his 14-point speech, Wilson had outlined his plan for the end of the Great War and his grand vision for a lasting peace. But if he were to have any hope of achieving it, he'd need to keep control of Congress.
Wilson is doing whatever he possibly can to try to help Democrats win in the 1918 midterm elections. And one thing that is going to be used against them in state after state is their opposition to suffrage.
I don't think he, at heart, changed his mind about where women's place was. But over time, between Carrie Chapman Catt and Alice Paul, he became convinced of the political expediency for himself, and more importantly for his party, of putting through the constitutional amendment. By late morning on January 10th, 1918, it was standing room only in the House, with nervous suffragists counting and recounting their too-close-to-call tallies. When at last the clerk announced the final vote, 274 in favor, 136 opposed, a mad cheer went up from the galleries. The amendment had passed the required two-thirds majority by a single vote. As exultant suffragists made their way through the Capitol corridors and out into the streets, crying and singing hymns, few could doubt that Wilson's last-minute support had made a difference. What accounted for his conversion was less clear.
Carrie Catt believed that it was her slow cultivation, her slow political seduction of him, proving American women deserved the vote, proving their patriotism through wartime, proving their citizenship. And Alice Paul claims credit because she embarrassed him in the eyes of the world by calling him a hypocrite. They were both right.
You could make the argument that Catt and Paul were almost working in tandem, and that if you didn't know better and if you didn't know the level of animosity that existed, you might think that this was actually a strategy.
This is not unusual in social political movements. What happens is that there is a split off of a more militant wing, and there's severe disagreements about tactics and strategy. But the upshot of it is that the two efforts work very well together, where the more militant wing is really pushing things forward and shifting the agenda and calling a lot of attention, but it makes the mainstream seem much more acceptable.
The reality is, the moderate looks moderate only because somebody out there is making a fool of themselves or pushing the line a little further. If not, they're the radical.
When Alice Paul's boisterous troops returned to the Woman's Party headquarters, flush from the House victory, they found Miss Paul was already there, bent over her desk. 11 votes to win before we can pass the Senate, was all she said. When she wrote to her lieutenants in early January 1918, Carrie Chapman Catt was confident they'd make short work of the Senate. So much so that she had a new dress sewn for the ratification campaign in her favorite shade of blue. But week after week, the dress went unworn. Prohibition, the 18th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, had sailed through both houses of Congress just before the new year. But on the suffrage amendment, the Senate refused to budge. A vote scheduled for March was blocked by opponents and delayed until May, then delayed once more. It wasn't until September that the bill finally came to the floor for debate, and by then, no one was more anxious for it to pass than the president. The end of the Great War was finally in sight, the German army all but defeated, and Wilson, intent on dictating the terms of the peace, was looking to boost his credibility abroad.
America, having built itself up as a power, was now assuming a role as a world leader. But America was no longer a world leader in terms of democracy. The US was actually falling behind other comparable countries, like Russia and Germany and the United Kingdom, who had all enfranchised women before America did.
There's this perception that Wilson is working against as he prepares to negotiate the peace as the beacon of democracy, that he lacks some moral foundation. And so he's working to get that liability off of his sheet.